Right now, as you lay in the dark, you are likely trapped in a cold, rigid paralysis of the mind. Your chest feels tight, constricted by an invisible tape measure that is constantly checking the distance between where you are and where you think you should have landed. You are entirely frozen by the agonizing fear of making a wrong turn, staring down the invisible corridors of your future, trying to mentally calculate every possible choice to ensure zero regret. There is a specific heavy ache that comes from believing that one single misstep, one single flawed decision, or one wasted year will permanently ruin the architecture of your life. Maybe you have spent this entire day suspended in a state of chronic hesitation, watching everyone else move forward with an apparent, clean certainty, while your own potential feels like a heavy burden you cannot afford to misplace. If this cold knot of perfectionism is keeping you awake tonight, know that you can drop the heavy blueprint right here on the floor. In this room, the air is cool and smells faintly of dry linen and the quiet, comforting scent of old floorboards. The corners of your space are soft, melting into a deep, dark shadow that has no need for sharp lines or perfect angles. The mattress beneath you does not require you to justify your existence, nor does it demand that you show a flawless map of your next 10 years before it agrees to hold your weight. You are not a damaged piece of construction that needs to be frantically chiseled into alignment before morning. Your current state of hesitation is not a personal defect, but merely the natural fatigue of a mind that has been trying to outsmart an unpredictable world. Tonight, we are not going to force your spirit to make a single decision, nor will we demand that you find the hidden, correct path through your current confusion. Consider a strange, liberating paradox that sits at the center of your exhaustion. The mind convinces you that if you just analyze your life with enough intensity, you will eventually discover a flawless, pre-made path in the forest that leads to absolute security. Yet, in the light of classic Buddhist wisdom, this search for an error-free existence is the very mechanism that keeps you frozen. In place, we assume that our terror of making mistakes is a protective shield, a necessary guardrail that keeps our potential safe from harm. In reality, that guardrail is a self-imposed prison cell, a rigid cage built out of thoughts that prevents the raw timber of your life from ever meeting the real ground. When you look at your future through the lens of decision paralysis, you are treating your existence as if it were a delicate, fragile sculpture that will shatter into pieces at the first sign of an imperfect cut. You believe that your piece is a static trophy waiting for you at the end of a series of flawless choices. But what if your true worth is actually existing in the unmeasured, uncarved space of your life, completely independent of the paths you choose or abandon? The early masters of the Zen tradition often noticed that our deepest suffering multiplies when we try to force a world made of shifting elements to match a perfect, static drawing in our heads. We look at our complex, unpredictable days and demand that they behave like neat geometric diagrams. When a relationship drops away or a career choice reveals a hidden flaw, we treat it as an existential catastrophe, believing that we have broken the design of our lives beyond repair. We begin to beat our own hearts with the heavy mallet of self-judgment, hoping to shame ourselves into absolute precision, only to paralyze the very feet that are meant to carry us forward. If it feels right to you in this quiet hour, let your neck and your lower jaw loosen, just a fraction of an inch into the surface supporting you. You do not have to solve the long equation of your future before your eyes are allowed to close tonight. There is absolutely no demand for you to present a finished monument to the darkness. Right now, you can allow your entire life to be exactly like a massive, raw block of mountain cedar resting quietly on a bed of dry moss. The wood does not worry about the shape it might take next winter. It does not scold itself for lacking smooth surfaces, nor does it view its uncarved, rough bark as a failure of discipline. It simply occupies its space in the forest, holding its immense potential in total, unbothered silence. Let yourself notice the simple, physical reality of the air as it slides into your throat and expands your lower ribs. You do not need to count the seconds of your inhalation, and you do not need to achieve a perfect, meditative posture to be worthy of this quiet. Just let the breath enter and leave your frame like a soft breeze, passing through a wide timber shed, observing how the muscles of your belly rise and fall without any internal commentary. With every long exhale, imagine that you are letting the heavy tape measure of your calculations slip out of your hands. You can allow the exhausting laboratory of your expectations to go completely dark for the evening. In a short while, we will travel down a mountain path to a drafty timber framing shed to look at this human terror of the wrong choice through a completely different lens. But before we journey there, let your awareness settle completely into the physical boundary of this moment. You are here, you are breathing, and you are entirely safe enough to let your defenses soften. The illusion that you must find a perfect, pre-approved path can be left outside your door like a heavy, rusted tool. You do not need that tool tonight. You do not need to carve a single line into your tomorrow. Listen closely to the vast quiet that remains when the heavy calculations of your mind begin to taper off into the dark. That quiet is deep. It is spacious, and it contains no right or wrong directions. It is the uncarved sanctuary that has always held you, waiting patiently for you to realize that you cannot ruin a life that is made of change. Let the weight of your shoulders sink down, and let the long anxiety of your choices dissolve into the unmeasured, aromatic dark. Let us allow our awareness to drift backward, climbing a long, winding stone stairway that ascends into the mist-shrouded peaks of the southern province. High above the mountain villages, tucked away in a quiet fold of the western ridge, stood a sprawling, drafty timber framing shed belonging to an ancient mountain monastery. The air up here always carried the sharp, clean scent of green sawdust, damp moss, and cold rain. Inside this open-sided workspace lived a young novice builder named Kenji, who spent his evenings walking among rows of stacked logs with a heavy, troubled heart. Kenji had been given a rare, precious assignment. He was tasked with creating the massive support beams for a new meditation hall that would sit on the edge of the cliff. Yet, for 3 long months, Kenji had not made a single cut into the timber. A massive log of mountain cedar lay before him on the heavy oak trestles, its thick bark still carrying the dust of the high forest. Kenji was completely paralyzed by a profound, cold terror. Every morning, he stood over the raw wood with his steel adze in his hand, trying to visualize the perfect temple that must emerge from it. Every evening, he laid his tools down in despair, terrified that a single inaccurate stroke of his blade would permanently ruin the magnificent timber and waste his entire potential. He spent his nights replaying every technique he had ever been taught, trying to mentally calculate every angle, to guarantee there would be no mistake, until his whole life felt as stiff and unyielding as a frozen branch. The elder of the building guild was a half-deaf old temple joiner named Brother Koi, a man who had spent 50 years assembling the giant, interlocking frames of mountain sanctuaries without using a single iron nail. Koji's face was deeply creased like the bark of an old oak, and his thumbs were thick and rough from a lifetime of handling coarse wood. He noticed the white-knuckled grip with which Kenji held his measuring lines and the deep lines of exhaustion that had etched themselves around the young man's mouth. Instead of shouting or offering a complicated lecture on geometry, Koi stepped up to the main workbench and picked up a heavy, notched wooden mallet. The mallet was an extraordinary, weathered object. It was carved from a single dense knot of wild apple wood, heavily bruised and indented from decades of driving square pegs into stubborn mortise joints. The handle was dark, stained by the oil of Koji's skin, and the striking face was deeply pitted, carrying the scars of 1,000 collisions with unyielding timber. Brother Koi approached the giant, untouched cedar log where Kenji stood frozen in his daily hesitation. The old man did not ask Kenji why he was crying, and he did not ask for a copy of his architectural drawings. He simply placed the heavy wooden mallet into the center of the raw log, its notched weight making a solid, muffled thud against the thick bark. He looked at Kenji with his sharp, faded eyes and asked a very simple question. He asked the young novice if he believed the strength of a great hall lived in the perfection of the drawings or in the hidden spaces where the rough pieces of wood were forced to meet. Kenji dropped his head, his hands trembling, as he confessed his deep, agonizing shame. He told the old joiner that every time he looked at the steel adze, he saw 100 different ways he could ruin the wood. He was so terrified of making a flawed cut that his entire body felt like stone, unable to move forward, unable to begin. Brother Koi smiled quietly, a sound like dry paper rubbing together, emerging from his throat. He took the heavy, notched wooden mallet back into his palms and positioned a crude iron chisel over a rough, unplaned section of the cedar bark. He did not spend an hour calculating the grain, and he did not consult a map of measurements. With a swift, unhurried swing of his thick arm, he brought the mallet down onto the head of the chisel with a loud, ringing clack that echoed through the empty rafters of the shed. A large, jagged chunk of raw bark flew off the log, landing in the shavings at their feet, leaving a pale, irregular scar across the face of the red wood. Kenji gasped, stepping back in horror at what looked like an act of careless destruction. The cut was not square, it was not smooth, and it did not match any traditional architectural style. The old man placed his rough palm over the pale, exposed scar on the cedar. He told Kenji that the mind always demands a perfect, unblemished piece of timber before it will allow the construction to begin. But a true joiner knows that the wood you find in the forest is never a neat geometric drawing. It has grown through winters of heavy snow. It has been twisted by high winds, and its core is filled with hidden knots and pockets of sticky resin. If you wait for a log that has no flaws, you will spend your entire life standing in an empty shed, watching your tools rust in the damp air. The strength of a true mortise joint does not come from a flawless blueprint that you execute with robotic precision. It comes from the rough, Honest friction of two imperfect pieces of wood meeting each other in the real world, binding together precisely, because their surfaces are uneven and real. Kenji stood perfectly still, the cold mountain breeze lifting the edges of his linen sleeve as he stared at the pale gash in the wood. The raw, aromatic scent of fresh cedar sap rose from the wound, filling his senses with a sharp, heavy perfume that felt remarkably grounded. Brother Koi handed the heavy, notched wooden mallet back to the young man. He told Kenji that his fear of making a mistake was not a sign of respect for the temple, but rather an attempt to outsmart the changing nature of reality. He was trying to build a building in his mind where no rain could ever fall, and no timber could ever warp. The old man told him to take a single, imperfect cut, not to create a masterpiece, but to let the tool finally meet the wood. As the purple shadows of evening began to fill the valleys, below the ridge, Kenji raised his arm. His hand was still shaking, and his mind was still screaming 100 different warnings about the danger of a ruined line. But he looked at the bruised, notched face of the old mallet, and he let his arm drop. The wooden mallet struck the chisel with a dull, clumsy thud, and a small sliver of cedar peeled away from the log. It was uneven. It was slightly crooked, and it was entirely real. But the deeper mountainside held secrets that Kenji's knife had not yet uncovered, and a much heavier storm was already gathering along the high rock walls of the upper peaks. This rough, pale gash, left by the heavy mallet in the mountain timber, is not an instruction to turn your heart into a cold block of concrete. True spiritual stability does not require you to shut down your human hopes or to become an unfeeling statue that sits untouched by the real disappointments of life. Zen wisdom points us toward a far gentler, more compassionate space that exists just beneath our chronic anxiety. When we observe Kenji standing in that cold timber framing shed, frozen over his tools, we are looking directly into our own Latinite exhaustion. The primary weight that was crushing the young builder's wrists was not the actual mass of the mountain cedar, but the imaginary architecture of a future that had to be completely flawless before it was allowed to exist. Perhaps you are carrying that identical internal tightness right now, under the cover of your dark room. We often assume that our deep emotional fatigue is a direct result of our outer circumstances, caused by the jobs we did not take, the relationships that shifted unexpectedly, or the years we feel we dropped like broken tools in the dirt. But if we let our awareness sit quietly in the dark, we can begin to see a much more subtle truth. The raw pain of a difficult day is like the natural knot found deep within the grain of the wood. It is simply there, a solid fact of our human experience. The real suffering, however, is the extra layer of calculation we apply. Afterward, the invisible friction of a mind that keeps dragging the heavy tape measure over the same old scar, demanding to know why the timber could not have been perfectly straight. The Buddha observed that human existence naturally includes moments of irregularity, unexpected turns, and seasons of complete unknowing. These conditions are as woven into our lives as the knots that form when a tree endures a harsh winter. Yet, we tend to multiply this basic discomfort. We take a single, imperfect choice and weave an endless, terrifying story around it, a mental blueprint filled with self-accusations and frantic warnings about our future. We create a fictitious, immaculate standard in our heads, and then we use that invisible measurement to beat our own spirits, paralyzing the very feet that are trying to take a single step forward. What we call attachment is nothing more than this white-knuckled grip on a specific, rigid drawing of how your life was supposed to unfold. It is the urgent voice that insists you are not allowed to be at peace until every edge of your reality has been planed down to a flawless, smooth finish. This mental gripping creates a deep, burning thirst, an agonizing craving that turns the present moment into nothing more than a dangerous obstacle to be outsmarted. We treat tonight as an inconvenient delay, a rough patch of timber that we must frantically correct before we can finally give ourselves permission to breathe. When you operate from this state of chronological panic, you are constantly pulling yourself away from the actual ground under your feet. You are attempting to build an entire temple in the clouds using the phantom energy of a tomorrow that hasn't arrived, while neglecting the solid, raw material that is resting in your lap right now. True awareness begins the very moment you lay down that heavy measuring line. It is the soft capacity to look at your current life with all its loose threads and asymmetrical corners, without immediately treating it as a total disaster. It is the simple willingness to stand in the drafty workshop of your own experience and allow the uncarved wood to just be wood, without demanding that it instantly transform into a magnificent monument. This softening of the mind is not an act of lazy defeat or a sign that you have abandoned your true potential. Rather, it is a profound realization of how life actually changes. You are choosing to stop spending your vital energy on a civil war against the grain of your reality. You are recognizing that true strength is not a static perfection, but a dynamic resilience that develops through the honest, imperfect friction of meeting the world as it is. The continuous impermanence of our days is not a threat to your security, but the exact guarantee that your current state of paralysis cannot last forever. The fiber of your life is shifting, even while you are resting, rearranging its density beneath the surface of your conscious thoughts. When you practice this deep emotional acceptance, you are offering a rare form of kindness to your own tired heart. You are deciding that you have been your own harshest critic for long enough. You are choosing to meet your hesitations, not with a sharp blade of self-reproach, but with the warm, unhurried presence of a true companion who stands with you in the uncarved dark. You are allowing the extra, exhausting layers of judgment to fall away from your choices, leaving only the clean, simple reality of the breath you are taking right now. Consider how much lighter your chest becomes when you realize you do not have to carve out your entire destiny tonight. You do not have to settle the equations of your next 5 years or find the correct solution to every lingering dilemma before you are allowed to rest. Those future years are nothing more than words sketched on a layout that the mind keeps turning over in the dark. Tonight, your only territory is the immediate, soft perimeter of this mattress and the slow, cool air that moves into your body and carries away the heat of your calculations. Let the thoughts of where you should have been drop into the darkness, like heavy wooden chips falling into the sawdust on the floor. You can listen to the vast, open space that remains when the comparison stops. In a short while, we will explore a direct, somatic way to let this unmeasured stillness sink into the very center of your physical framework, anchoring you far beneath the urgent voices of your mind. But for now, let yourself absorb the quiet grace of being completely uncarved. There is no shame in the raw wood of your life. For it is precisely where the deepest, most resilient strength is quietly gathering its power. If it feels right to you now, let us bring this drafty wood framing shed closer to your own physical body. You do not need to sit up or alter your current position in any way. You can remain exactly as you are, letting your limbs settle deeper into the firm, unquestioning support of the mattress beneath you. Perhaps you might allow your eyelids to grow a bit heavier, letting the visual world dissolve into a soft, dark, unmeasured canvas. There is no need to perform a perfect relaxation technique tonight. There is no standard you have to meet in this quiet space. Even simply noticing the slow expansion of your ribcage is completely enough to anchor your spirit. Let us begin by bringing a very soft, unhurried attention to the rhythm of your breath. As the air moves inward, feel the cool touch of the night atmosphere inside the nasal passages. As the air moves outward, notice the subtle warmth that leaves your body, carrying away a small pocket of the heat that has built up in your forehead during the day. If you choose to, you might imagine that each breath is like a slow plane, smoothing down a rough piece of timber. There is no need to force the breath to become deeper or slower than it naturally wants to be. Just let the lungs fill according to their own biological rhythm, like a quiet room that opens and closes its doors in absolute silence. As you follow this natural flow, you might notice a specific thought drifting into your awareness, a lingering worry about a choice you have to make, a memory of a path you regret abandoning, or a sudden flash of panic about making an incorrect turn tomorrow. Do not push that thought away with aggression, and do not try to delete it from your mind. When we fight our thoughts, we are only swinging that heavy mallet against our own grain, creating more splinters and more inner noise. Instead, just name the pattern quietly to yourself. You might softly say the word measuring, or perhaps the word hesitating inside your mind. By simply giving it a gentle name, you are stepping out of the frantic calculation and becoming the quiet observer who stands on the solid floor of the shed. Now, if it feels comfortable, imagine that this specific decision, anxiety, this heavy weight of needing to be absolutely correct, can be collected from the spaces around your temples. Picture yourself gently placing this sharp, jagged worry directly into that massive, uncarved cedar block we visited up in the mountain workshop. See the thought sinking into the dense, thick bark of the wood, where the heavy grain surrounds it, cushions it, and takes away its cutting edge. The cedar does not judge the thought. It does not call it a mistake or a success. It simply absorbs the heat of that mental friction into its own endless, aromatic interior. Watch what happens to that image as you let go of your grip on the handle of your calculations. In the quiet dark of the wood fibers, the sharp lines of your plans and deadlines slowly begin to soften. The rigid angles of your expectations dissolve into the rich, protective darkness of the heartwood. The worry is no longer a weapon used against your heart, but simply a raw material, a tiny particle of dust that is resting in the dark womb of preparation. It can sit there for weeks or months or years, completely safe from the burning heat of judgment, accumulating the quiet density that can only grow when you stop trying to shape the future. With the next few exhales, let your physical body mimic that unbothered stability of the uncarved timber. You might feel your jaw slacken just a bit, releasing the hidden clenches that carry the tension of trying to plan your path. Let your shoulders drop down, sinking heavily into the mattress like massive cedar beams, settling into the foundation of an ancient hall after a long journey down the mountain. Let the muscles in your lower back, your hips, and your thighs surrender their entire weight to the bed, trusting that the ground beneath you is perfectly capable of holding everything you are carrying. You do not need to support your own life right now. The earth has you completely supported. Perhaps your mind will try to wander back to the surface, back to the old habit of calculating your errors. If that happens, there is no need to feel frustrated or think that you are failing at this practice. You can return to the breath whenever you are ready, without a single word of self-reproach. The mind has been trained for decades to run in circles around its blueprints, and it takes time for that tired animal to realize that the workshop door is wide open tonight. Every time you notice the wandering and gently bring your awareness back to the cool touch of the air, you are loosening one more knot in the rope of urgency. There is absolutely no requirement for immediate emotional healing or instant transformation tonight. We are not trying to force a sudden, dramatic breakthrough that cures your hesitation By tomorrow morning, we are simply allowing the mind to spend a few hours resting in its own unformed space. You are giving yourself the rare permission to be completely unfinished, completely unpolished, and completely safe in your current stillness. Let the rhythmic motion of your breath carry you deeper down, away from the loud demands of the geometric world, and into the silent velvet of this timeless night. 7 autumns dissolved into white mountain frosts, and Kenji's hands grew to match the rough timber he shaped. He no longer trembled before the raw logs, and his cuts had found a deep, rhythmic honesty. Yet, the old habit of the calculating mind was merely waiting for a heavier hammer to strike it. That hammer arrived during a seasonal monsoon of unprecedented ferocity. A sudden, massive mudslide roared down the upper northern face of the mountain, tearing through the newly completed courtyard of the East Wing Temple. The great support columns Kenji had calculated with such obsessive care did not snap, but the very cliffside beneath them liquefied, shifting the stone foundations by 3 feet. The entire East Hall groaned, tilted at a bizarre, fractured angle, and became a dangerous, uninhabitable ruin of joints and sagging rooflines. When Kenji stood in the pouring rain, looking at the twisted wreckage of his years of labor, a cold, suffocating wave of his childhood shame flooded his chest. The old voice roared back with a terrifying velocity, screaming that his calculations had been flawed from the beginning, that his life was an architecture of errors, and that his inability to foresee the mountain's movement proved his complete unworthiness. Miserable, unable to sleep, and frozen by a renewed, paralyzing dread of ever making another architectural blueprint, Kenji walked away from the timber framing shed. He climbed past the timber lines, ascending into a desolate, windswept region of the high peak where trees could no longer find purchase. In the gravel here, nestled inside a sunless, grey basin of shattered stone, lived an old, reclusive stonecutter named Sister Rin. The air in Rin's quarry was incredibly crisp, smelling of wet flint, cold gunpowder dust, and the icy mist that rolled off the high glaciers. Rin was a tiny woman with silver hair cropped close to her skull, her forearms corded like ancient vines from a lifetime of striking steel against mountain rock. She spent her days splitting massive slabs of slate to be used for the roofs of the lower shrines. When Kenji reached her camp, he did not find a comforting presence. Rin was kneeling in the grey dust, holding a single, rough, unpolished slate-splitting wedge. The wedge was a brutal, unadorned piece of blackened iron, its head flattened and mushroomed out from thousands of blows, its tapered tip nicked and scratched by the unyielding density of the stone. She did not offer him hot tea, and she did not ask him about his ruined building. She simply kicked a massive, raw slab of blue slate toward his feet and gestured for him to pick up a heavy iron sledge. She told him that if he wished to remain in her quarry, he had to produce 40 perfect thin roofing tiles before the sun touched the western ridge. Kenji, desperate to redeem his sense of control, gripped the heavy sledgehammer and stared at the dark, silent slab of stone. He began to run his fingers over its cold surface, trying to analyze the hidden lines of its structure, trying to mentally calculate the exact geometric center to avoid a single wasted fracture. For nearly an hour, he stood frozen over the stone, his mind spinning in a frantic labyrinth of geometry and panic, terrified that one wrong blow would shatter the slate into worthless rubble. Seeing his hesitation, his body stiffened into that same old, rigid paralysis that had haunted his youth. Sister Rin let out a sharp, dismissive grunt. She stepped forward, snatched the heavy iron sledge from his white knuckles, and slid the rough, unpolished slate splitting wedge directly into a small, irregular cranny on the side of the stone. She did not measure the angle, and she did not wait for absolute certainty. With an explosive, casual swing, she brought the hammer down onto the battered head of the wedge. A sharp, dry crack ripped through the sunless basin. The massive stone did not shatter into dust, nor did it split along a perfectly straight line. It divided cleanly along an invisible, undulating horizontal seam that had been hidden deep within its darkness since the beginning of the world. The resulting face of the slate was rough, wavy, and carried a beautiful, crystalline texture that no human chisel could ever imitate. The old woman picked up one of the separated slabs, holding its uneven, grey edge up to Kenji's face. She told him that his suffering did not come from the failure of his temple joints, but from his foolish illusion that the mountain was supposed to remain static to accommodate his drawings. She explained that the slate grows in layers, built out of centuries of mud and pressure, carrying its own internal flaws, its own historical wrinkles, and its own unpredictable soft spots. If you tried to force the stone to split according to a perfect line you drew in your warm library, it will defy you, breaking into jagged pieces that will cut your throat. But a true cutter does not demand a perfect line. She places the wedge directly into the floor itself, trusting that the stone already knows how it needs to yield. Kenji looked down at the rough, undulating texture of the split slate, feeling the cold dust settle onto the damp skin of his hands. A profound realization opened up inside his chest. Not like a sudden explosion, but like the slow, unhurried melting of winter ice. He saw that his entire life had been an exhausting attempt to build a world with no seams, a world where no foundation could ever slide, and no human choice could ever lead to grief. He had been treating his thoughts as absolute blueprints, believing that if he just worried with enough intensity, he could eliminate the very nature of change. Transformation did not make Kenji a flawless master in that moment, nor did it erase the heavy sadness of his ruined temple. But he chose to do one small, disciplined thing differently. He did not run away from the stone, and he did not launch into a long self-defense. He simply sat down in the grey quarry dust, letting the heavy sledgehammer rest between his knees Before he reached for the iron wedge, he closed his eyes and took one slow, deliberate breath, letting his awareness drop completely down into the uncertain, cold reality of the mountain air. He accepted the fact that he could not control the cliffside, and he accepted the fact that his hands might fail again. When he placed the rough iron wedge into the next stone, he did not hit it with the fury of a man trying to conquer an enemy. He struck the metal with a firm, measured obedience to the material before him. The stone parted with a clean, low snap, its face uneven, slightly curved, and entirely functional. Kenji looked at the raw tile, realizing that his suffering was not found in the crumbling walls of his old hall, but in his refusal to let the mountain have its own changing life. He stood up in the grey light, his shoulders finally dropping their invisible parameters, ready to sit with the uncertainty of the next blow. This slow, heavy release in the sunless quarry opens our eyes to the true nature of our own internal friction. When you lie awake in the solitude of your room, your mind is doing exactly what Kenji did before he dropped the iron sledge. You are trying to pre-calculate the texture of every day before it even arrives. You rehearse your future like an architect who wants to prevent a cloud from ever casting a shadow over his roof. You replay your past, turning over old choices like a craftsman who keeps staring at a misaligned mortise joint from 5 years ago, wishing he could somehow uncut the timber. This chronic overthinking is driven by a profound terror of the uncarved space. We believe that if we do not constantly measure our worth, we will become completely irrelevant to the world. We seek the approval of others to validate our design, treating their opinions like the definitive rule that determines whether we are allowed to exist. When that validation is missing, we use shame as a crude tool for self-correction. We hope that if we hit our own hearts hard enough with criticism, we will somehow force our lives into perfect alignment. Eventually, we turn this very state of frustration into our entire identity. We become the artisan who identifies only with his ruined projects, refusing to see that the wood is still fragrant, still valuable, and still entirely whole. Ancient Buddhist insights offer a gentle clarity for this exact cycle of mental exhaustion. The teachings remind us that there is a vast, vital distinction between the natural weight of life and the extra suffering we construct through our habits of resistance. The first layer of discomfort is simply the honest impact of reality. It is like the natural knot found deep within the cedar log, or the frozen moisture that hides inside the slate fissure. This is the raw fact of a plan collapsing, the unexpected ending of a relationship, or the heavy fatigue of an aging body. This layer of experience is completely unavoidable. It belongs to the changing seasons of the mountain, and no amount of calculation can ever banish it from human existence. The true agony we feel, however, is entirely manufactured by our desire for absolute control. This extra suffering is like trying to bolt an expanding winter log to a frozen stone wall with an unyielding iron spike. When the seasons shift, the timber must swell and the mountain must contract. If the iron spike refuses to give a single fraction of an inch, the wood will tear its own heart out around the metal, creating a deep, ragged wound that splits the entire framework from top to bottom. The rigid spike does not stop the wood from moving. It only turns a natural, seasonal expansion into a catastrophic structural fracture. Our resistance is that iron spike. We slam it into our own lives. Every time we demand that an uncertain season behave like a permanent, unchanging monument, we believe that our self-judgment is a form of discipline that will fix our lives. In reality, it is simply the friction of the iron tearing through our own soft tissue. We are punishing ourselves for the crime of being made of changing elements. True tranquility does not arrive because you finally discover a magical forest where the timber never warps and the cliffs never slide. You cannot alter the geology of the mountain, and you cannot force the world to honor your private schedule. Peace begins the exact millisecond you choose to alter your relationship with the iron spike itself. It is the realization that the strength of your life does not depend on your ability to remain perfectly rigid in a storm. You can learn the quiet art of the interlocking wooden peg. A master builder uses a peg carved from the same organic material as the beams themselves. The peg holds the structure together with an immense security, yet it remains flexible enough to breathe with the humidity of the valleys. It allows the frame to adapt, to shift, and to settle without ever losing its core integrity. When you drop the need for absolute certainty, you are replacing the iron spike of your judgment with the flexible peg of your awareness. You are allowing your life to have its own natural movement, shift. This shift in perspective completely changes how you relate to your own history. Those years that feel like a massive failure are no longer viewed as structural defects that must be hidden away in shame. They are recognized as the exact points where your grain had to twist to accommodate a heavy wind. The cracks in your plans are not proofs of your incompetence, but the very places where the stone is revealing its authentic, internal seam. You can stop treating your thoughts as if they were infallible architectural blueprints. They are merely passing breezes rattling the windows of your workshop. Let the physical casing of your chest expand as you absorb this realization. You can let go of the exhausting project of trying to cure your own humanity through the application of shame. Tonight, you can allow the entire jury of your expectations to fall completely silent. You do not need to present a flawless temple to the dark, and you do not need to prove your speed to the sky. You can let your awareness rest deeply within the unhurried fiber of your own being, knowing that the uncarved wood is already safe, already quiet, and already sufficient for the heart that has finally stopped running from its own depth. As you settle further into the dark, consider how much lighter your mind becomes when it is no longer required to defend its boundaries. You can let the heavy hammer of your self-criticism slide onto the floorboards of your room. You can allow your mistakes to just be rough cuts in the timber, steps in a long process that does not need to be finished before your eyes are allowed to close. There is no score to settle tonight, and there is no blueprint to complete. There is only the slow, cool air moving through the empty spaces of your frame, carrying you down toward a rest that requires no justification. Now let us carry this heavy, unpolished, slate-splitting wedge and the fragrant shavings of the mountain cedar directly into the landscape of your modern tomorrow. When the sun climbs over the horizon and the loud, demanding choreography of your daily routine begins, this ancient wisdom is not meant to remain locked inside a distant timber shed. It is designed to be lived in the very center of your ordinary hours. Perhaps you will encounter the familiar constriction of this geometric anxiety tomorrow afternoon when you find yourself staring at a glowing screen, waiting for a single text or a notification that seems to determine your entire emotional value for the day. It is so easy in that brief second to reach for your phone with a white-knuckled grip, frantically seeking a piece of reassurance to prove that your life is still on its correct track. You might feel this deep, silent pressure when you navigate a crowded street, observing peers who appear to be moving with a sharp, geometric precision toward their grand landmarks of success. In those moments, we often put on our most elaborate, smiling masks, pretending to be completely unbothered while carrying an immense weight of insufficiency beneath our heavy winter coats. We look at our separate, struggling history through the selective window of a social application, treating the smooth profiles of others as if they were flawless blueprints that highlight the crooked angles of our own slow construction. We stand in the middle of our days feeling thoroughly behind, as if we had dropped our tools in the dirt, while the rest of the world was completing its magnificent sanctuaries. The practice of this Zen path does not require you to drop your current responsibility or abandon the people who depend on your care. It is practiced in the tiny micro-pauses that occur between your daily tasks, through the simple choosing of a softer relationship with reality. When that old panic of making an incorrect choice strikes your heart tomorrow morning, you can choose to pause for the length of a single slow breath before you click send on an email or reply to an unsettling comment. In that quiet interval, you can recognize that the loud, frantic calculations in your forehead are not absolute structural blueprints. They are merely loose wood chips rattling around the floorboards of your mind. You can choose not to pick up the heavy iron sledgehammer of your self-criticism. You can learn the rare art of caring deeply for your projects and your relationships without trying to lock them into an unchanging, rigid framework with an iron spike. When you find yourself trying to force an answer from a situation that is still unformed, remember the raw block of mountain cedar resting on its bed of moss, trying to yank a career transition or a complex emotional bond into a sudden, perfect shape. Only splits the delicate fibers that require time to adjust to the grain of the world. You can provide the clean workshop of your daily effort. You can clear away the dust of yesterday's regrets. And then you can have the immense bravery to leave the material alone in its uncarved stillness. Perhaps the most radical act of self-forgiveness you can offer yourself tomorrow is to allow your body to rest without requiring a receipt of your optimization. To justify the pause, we have been conditioned to believe that our human value must be earned by running ourselves to the very point of exhaustion, treating every hour of non-doing as a dangerous mistake that will ruin our potential. But in the light of the stonecutter's wisdom, rest is not a reward for a perfectly straight cut. It is the fundamental space where the density of your spirit is allowed to settle into its true alignment. You do not need to apologize to the world for sitting quietly with your hands in your lap, or for letting your eyes close in the middle of a heavy, grey afternoon. You are simply allowing the irregular seams of your life to breathe without the pressure of the tape measure. When the mind tries to drag you into a frantic rehearsal of a tomorrow that hasn't occurred, pull your awareness back to the immediate physical facts of your immediate environment. Feel the solid texture of the coffee mug against the skin of your palms, or notice the cool temperature of the floorboards pressing against the soles of your feet. These simple sensory realities are your flexible wooden pegs, pinning you firmly into the only space where your life actually exists. You are not late for your destiny because your destiny is only unfolding in the exact millimeter of the present breath. As the daylight begins to taper off once more, you can feel an immense sense of relief washing over your limbs. The long, exhausting project of trying to prove your worth to an imaginary audience can be completely retired for the evening. You can look back at the day you have just completed with all its undone chores and unrefined edges, and you can offer it a gentle, accepting nod. It was a day of subterranean settling, a day of allowing the wood to adjust to the mountain wind, and that is more than enough to be holy. You can lay your tools down on the workbench, slip off the heavy armor of your expectations, and allow your entire being to drift toward the vast, timeless sanctuary of the night. The room has grown completely still now, and the rigid tape measure of the waking world has completely dropped away from your mind. You can let your awareness slide down from the noisy, geometric demands of numbers, plans, and expectations, sinking softly into the vast, protective dark of this immediate night. The long journey through the drafty timber shed and the high frosted slate quarry is entirely finished, and the wisdom of the uncarved wood is settling into the very marrow of your bones. Your breath is becoming a quiet whisper, a soft, undulating ripple that passes through a body that has finally chosen to lay down its heavy iron tools. With each slow release of air, your limbs are growing, increasingly heavy, sinking into the soft support of the mattress like a dense block of old cedar, settling into the deep, damp moss of the quietest forest floor. There is an immense heavy comfort in realizing that you do not need to build a single thing over the course of these dark hours. The exhausting task of correcting your posture, analyzing your mistakes, and proving your worth to the world can be completely suspended. The darkness of this room is a sanctuary where you are entirely permitted to be unformed, unpolished, and completely hidden from the sharp light of evaluation. You can let the muscles around your eyes soften, letting the heavy velvet of sleep wash over your vision as your consciousness prepares to return to its original, unmeasured home. Imagine your tired mind descending smoothly into the cool, dark center of an ancient mountain tree, far beneath the high peaks where the winter wind is blowing itself out. Down in these thick, protective depths, there are no corners to square, and there are no straight lines demanding a perfect execution. The uncarved heartwood sleeps securely within its thick layers of old bark, completely indifferent to the storms raging outside, knowing that its raw, unchiseled state is not a failure, but the very cradle of its enduring substance. You are that heartwood tonight, heavy, unbothered, and entirely absolved from the requirement to match a neat blueprint before the morning. Let the weight of your head drop deeper into the pillow, releasing the very last percentage point of control you have carried since the dawn. Your shoulders are heavy, your chest is open and slow, and your legs are completely anchored in the deep, unmoving stillness of the bed. You do not have to solve the long riddle of your career, your relationships, or your unfulfilled years before your eyes close. You are given the absolute, unconditional permission to drop the project of your entire life for the night, leaving the unfinished pieces to sit quietly in the dark loam of reality, the silence that fills the spaces between your slow breaths is old, vast, and entirely unconcerned with human hurry. It is the same quiet density that held the mountain rock for thousands of years before the first iron chisel was ever forged. Let yourself dissolve into that timeless space, letting go of the boundary where your body ends and the night begins. You are safe enough to disappear into the dreamless dark, trusting that the ground has you held, and that the subterranean movement of your spirit is working in secret to heal the places you could never fix by overthinking. Listen to the rhythmic fading of the world as your consciousness glides into the deep, dark waters of sleep. There is nowhere else you need to travel, and there is no version of yourself you need to invent to be worthy of this rest. The winter is peaceful, the bark is thick, and the uncarved self is resting in absolute safety beneath the frost. What if the raw, uneven cracks you have been trying so frantically to chisel away were the only openings large enough to let the real light enter your soul? The raw cracks do not answer your frantic mind with arguments or formulas, because the stone and the timber speak only through their weight, their grain, and their long, unhurried presence. As you lie here in this dark room, letting your thoughts drift past the perimeter of the quarry, we find Kenji sitting on a flat ledge of granite as the mountain night begins to drape its purple cloth over the broken timber of the east hall. He did not return down the mountain to patch the joints immediately, and he did not pick up a notebook to draw a new set of geometric lines. Instead, he simply watched the dark mist sink into the valley below, listening to the deep, occasional sigh of the timbers as the structure settled its remaining weight into the shifting gravel. The air smelled intensely of cold minerals, crushed spruce needles, and the bitter ink that Sister Rin had used to mark the rough cleavage planes of the slate slabs. For the first time in his life, Kenji was not looking at the ruined courtyard as an indictment of his worth. He noticed a small wild vine that had been crushed beneath one of the fallen roof plates. The stem was bruised, its outer skin torn away to expose the white, fibrous pulp beneath. Yet its delicate, green tips were already beginning to curl around the edge of the fractured stone, reaching for the moisture of the low-lying clouds. The vine did not pause to scold the mountain for moving, and it did not enter a state of frozen panic because its original trajectory had been completely altered by the slide. It simply accepted the new layout of the ground, finding a way to crawl through the jagged space that the catastrophe had opened up. Sister Rin stepped out from her small stone hut, carrying a small iron bowl filled with a dark, sticky paste made from crushed charcoal and walnut oil. She did not speak words of comfort, and she did not tell him that his temple would rise again, more beautiful than before. She simply dipped her thick, calloused thumb into the black grease and smeared a rough, irregular circle over the raw gash that the mallet had left on his palms weeks ago. The oil felt incredibly cold against his skin, its thick texture blocking out the sharp biting of the alpine wind. She told him that when an artisan is young, he believes that the ultimate goal of his practice is to leave an indelible mark upon the world, a monument of his absolute precision that will never decay or change its form. But the real master knows that the true work is to let the world leave its mark upon him, softening his rigid edges until he is as fluid, as receptive, and as unbothered as the mountain mist itself. Let this thick, protective ointment of the mind settle over your own internal wounds tonight, as you feel the heavy pressure of the blankets holding your frame in place. You might imagine that your overactive, overcalculating brain is being gently coated with that cool, soothing walnut oil, closing up the dry cracks of your worries and shielding your awareness from the cold wind of your expectations. There is no need to sketch a single plan for tomorrow's work while your body is trying to return to its natural rhythm. the thoughts of your unfinished obligations, the memories of the choices you think you ruined, and the deep, silent fear of being inadequate are all being covered by this dark, healing paste, losing their capacity to sting or restrict your breathing. Kenji closed his eyes as he sat next to the old woman, letting his hands rest flat against the rough granite of the ledge. Beneath his palms, he could feel the immense, ancient vibration of the mountain itself. It was a massive, heavy presence that had existed for millions of winters before the first human tool had ever scratched its surface. The mountain did not care about the title of the temple, and it did not recognize the difference between a perfect mortise joint and a heap of splintered firewood. It simply held everything with an absolute, unconditional neutrality, allowing the slides to happen, the trees to grow, and the mist to dissolve, without a single moment of judgment or preference. Kenji realized that he was not a separate entity fighting against the mountain to build a perfect life. He was merely a tiny, transient cluster of elements moving within the mountain's immense, changing body. When you allow your awareness to drop down into that same deep neutrality, the heavy burden of your personal history begins to lose its suffocating grip. You can see that your current state of hesitation is not a permanent stain on your character, but merely a temporary configuration of thoughts that will shift as naturally as the clouds moving across the high peaks. You do not have to carry the identity of the person who made a mistake, or the person who is running out of time, or the person who must constantly prove their competence to an imaginary council of elders. You can simply be the vast, open space of the bedroom, a quiet sanctuary where the air moves in and out of the lungs, without needing to meet a single requirement or fulfill a single expectation. Consider the immense, liberating relief that arrives when you realize that your life path is not a pre-existing maze that you must solve with absolute accuracy to avoid a hidden trap. There is no secret blueprint hidden in the clouds that you are failing to discover. The path is nothing more than the physical print that your foot leaves behind when it strikes the real earth. Every choice you make, whether it leads to a beautiful temple or a heap of splintered wood in the rain, is a valid, necessary stroke of the tool upon the raw material of your existence. Each error is simply a pale gash that reveals the deep, fragrant texture of your inner grain, adding to your wisdom, your empathy, and your capacity to hold the suffering of other living things with a gentle, unhurried compassion. Sister Rin stood up, her dark linen robes rustling softly against the stones as she walked back toward her shelter. She did not look back to see if Kenji was following, and she did not ask him for a single promise about his future. She left him alone on the ledge with the heavy iron sledgehammer, the split slate tiles, and the immense, darkening sky. Kenji did not feel lonely in that isolation. He felt a profound, heavy sense of home. He was finally standing in the raw workshop of his own reality, completely stripped of his maps, completely stripped of his illusions of control, yet completely safe within his own skin. Your own physical framework can receive that exact sense of returning home tonight. You can let the muscles in your neck, your upper back, and your rib cage soften completely into the deep mattress, allowing the heavy gravity of the earth to claim your entire weight. There is no need to defend your boundaries, and there is no need to keep your guard up against the uncertainty of tomorrow. The world outside your room will continue to turn, according to its own complex, unhurried laws. and you do not need to oversee its machinery while your body is trying to rest. You can let the long, white, knuckled effort of your life fall to the floorboards like a heavy iron wedge that has finished its work for the season. Let the slow, rhythmic cadence of this prose act like a soft blanket of snow falling over the high quarry, burying the grey dust, the sharp flints, and the deep cracks under a single, unified layer of quiet, cold peace. The thoughts of your peers, the calculations of your bank balances, and the heavy anxieties of your career transitions are all being muffled by this soft, falling stillness, losing their edges and turning into a quiet, neutral dark that contains no demands and no timelines. You are safe enough to let your breathing become completely quiet, a soft, natural rise and fall that requires no monitoring and no precision to be perfect. As the night wraps its ultimate velvet folds around your room, allow yourself to drop the very last project of your conscious mind. You do not need to understand your life tonight, and you do not need to forgive yourself, and you do not need to find the correct direction for your next step. You can simply allow your entire being to become like that massive block of mountain cedar, resting securely in the deep moss of the forest, completely uncarved, completely unmeasured, and completely safe within the dark, fragrant sanctuary of its own unformed heart. Let the sleep wash over your forehead, letting your consciousness slide down into the dreamless, timeless silt of the earth, where there are no corners to square, no judgments to face, and no paths that can ever be truly lost. What if the true purpose of the uncarved block was never to be shaped by your frantic hands, but to simply rest here in the dark, completely whole, because it has no edges for the world to break?